Hi and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free tutorial today, we're going to learn how to set a heart-shaped gemstone in a jewel-faced pendant. So I sell a lot of heart-shaped gemstone pieces on my Monday night lives on Facebook, and I'm often asked how they can be set into jewellery. So today I'm going to show you how to use a wire wrapping technique to create this double tree heart pendant. Let's head down to the board and take a closer look at the project. So this is the design that we're going to work on together today. It's jewel faced, and although the piece I have on display here is a cabochon, so a slightly flatter back and a domed top, I'm going to show you how to work that with a carved heart, so puffy and raised, domed on both sides. So we are going to be working with quite a heavy wire today. I'm going to be using 1.25mm 16 gauge wire for the frame, and then a 0.6mm gauge 22 gauge for the trees itself. And this is to ensure that our beautiful gemstones are indeed kept safe. Now I think I'm going to be working with this delicious kunzite today. You can see the beautiful shimmer in that stone, although I do have some beautiful labradorite. That's my number one gemstone right there. So the first piece of wire we'll work with is a nice long piece of that 1.25mm 16 gauge wire. This is around about 14 inches, and my heart is around about 1 inch 25mm from top to across the top of the lobes there down to the base. But obviously if you're working with a much larger heart, you might need slightly more wire. Both ends of my 14-inch length of that 1.25mm are flush cut, but what we do need to do, because it's a heavy wire, is make sure that it's nice and smooth and warm, flexible and ready to work. So if you do struggle with the extra work that this kind of wire gauge takes, if you have issues with your wrists or fingers or whatever, then you can work with a slightly lighter 18 gauge 1mm wire, but I would recommend hammering the heart forms once we've created it. So that's made the wire nice and toasty. If you doubt that just using your fingers does anything, pop it on the back of your hand and you will feel the heat emanating from that wire. So you could grab a ruler to find the midpoint. I'm going to eyeball it as I always do and just start off with a nice sharp bend. I'm going to bring that immediately back out. I'm working with a puffy heart, and that's got a really nice smooth arcing base. All we're going to do really is to trace around the outside of the heart to the high point of the lobe on either side. And we're going to leave lots of space because I'm working with really chunky wire to make that tree shape as well. We do need to have lots of space around the outside of your chosen gemstone. Let's just pop that up in the corner. So I tend to use my hands to form the shape for the lobes, but if you need to, you could use a mandrel or a barrel or something around your home to help you get that shape. Just roll the wire around until you get the correct form. I like to use my hands to do this. It's a really great way to get used to handling wire to make jewellery effectively. So let's just start by curving that around, and then we'll just pop that over the top of the heart, and that's kind of the distance all the way around. So that's a good 4 to 5mm between the edge of the gemstone I've chosen to use and where the wire will lie. So I'm just going to continue to just smooth and form that around. Once you've warmed that wire really effectively, what you can do is go a little bit further away and just ask that to bend around. That's something that you get used to feeling. So you can see we'll need to bring that down a little bit closer as we go. Now, if you're brutal with your wire, it won't do the things you want it to do, so be kind to it, just go slowly, and what you'll find is the wire will do the things you want it to do. So I'm going to repeat that on the other side now, and just get that basic heart frame shape. Putting the time in and the effort to get the wire nice and toasty warm will honestly net you really good results. Now I think that's a little bit too close, so I'm just going to bring that over the top, and we'll just lay that over the top of the heart and see how close we are. So it's probably just a little bit tall still. but you don't want to spend hours watching me do this. So I'm just going to refine this for a few minutes, and then I'll meet you back with what we need to get in terms of the wire shape to work with and move on with the next stage. Putting in the extra time at this stage will genuinely help you so much in the long run, making sure that you've got the trace around the heart form and you've left about 4 to 5 millimeters all the way around. It genuinely is a little bit of a time suck, but it really does help make beautiful jewellery. One of the ways that you can ensure that the heart shape in wire is relative to the heart shape you're working with is to just slide that inside the frame and check that you're happy with how that all looks. The next thing that we're going to do is to turn these 2 wires up at the neckline. Now I've gone for quite a narrow bail on my demonstration piece. If you want to have a slightly heavier one, you absolutely can. You can even use a second set of wires from the second heart shape we're going to make in a second, but today I'm teaching the way where we're just going to turn those up utilizing your chain nose pliers. Let's just hold that, and if you imagine there's a straight line running up the center of the heart from the point to where those wires cross over, we need to be just to the right on this side. Push that up and away. If you don't move over slightly to the right, what will happen is that that first wire will be dead center, and then when you get to turn the second wire over, there's no space for it to be symmetrically opposing the first bend. Now because I'm right-handed, it's much easier for me to flip this over and do the same on the second side. Now do take a moment, take a breath, and imagine that you need to hold this second lobe in exactly the same place. Now again, you could use a ruler to make sure that this is absolutely accurate, or you could eyeball it like I am, or you could draw a heart frame around your cabochon and then trace that in wire on the board, and in that way you can then use a ruler to define where you want those uprights to occur, making sure that they are indeed symmetrically opposing one another. So that looks okay to me. I think it might be slightly too far to the middle, so what I'm going to do is just straighten up that one wire to make sure that they're like train tracks, like tram tracks if you prefer. And I might just take that a little bit further out. Now the way I'm going to do that is to just nibble along the wire. Now don't actually do that with your real teeth, but what you can do is just pop your pliers across where that bend occurs, and what you'll find is when you do that and again bend up and away, you've moved that bend just microscopically to the side, and that might just be enough to sit that exactly how you need it to be. So let's get that wire nice and straight. You can of course use nylon coated pliers if you're worried about tool marks. However, because I plan on putting some weaving on the bail, I'm not overly worried about it. So let's have a look and make sure that everything is going according to plan. Pop that heart back in the middle, and you can see we've got some space all the way around, anywhere sort of between 4 and 5 millimeters, unless your heart is very thick. So this is a relatively normal chubby heart. Sometimes you get quite deep chubby hearts, sometimes you get really skinny ones. So if it's a very deep heart, you might need slightly more than 5 millimeters. If it's a very skinny heart, or like this one, which was a cabochon, so domed on one side, flat on the back, by its nature, it's slimmer than a chubby heart. That only needed about 3 millimeters of extra space around the outside. What we're going to do now is to take a second piece of wire. This is again 1.25 millimeter, 16 gauge, but this time it's around about an 8-inch length. You do need to make sure, as always, that that wire is nice and warm and smooth and ready to work for you. The reason that this side is a shorter one is because I'm going to show you the simplest way to create a simple bail up at the top there. If you want to have a 4-strand wire bail up at the top, which is featured in another one of my videos, then you can absolutely make a second piece exactly the same. I'm going to show you the simplest way to achieve this design today. So let's find that midpoint. Pop the bend in, take it further than you need to, draw it back out, and then you can trace your first heart. Now again, I don't want you to sit and watch me have to do that bit by bit, so I'll join you back in a second when I've created a second heart form. So here you can see with the shorter piece of wire, I've created a fairly reasonable facsimile of the longer piece of heart-shaped wire. Do take your time, and if you are working with the lighter 1mm or 18 gauge wire, this is the point at which I would suggest you hammer the pieces. And when you're hammering, only go all the way around the heart shape. Do not hammer up on the sections that are coming away at the neckline, and do not hammer past the top of the hearts on the smaller one, but you could hammer all the way around here like so. So those wires are at the moment just crossing over and coming away from the design. What we need to do now is to put some right angle bends in the short piece of wire. And what we're going to do is make sure that the hearts line up. If you need to tape them together at this stage, that is absolutely fine. Just make sure that you're using tape which won't leave a residue that annoys you later. We're going to put a sharp bend in the shorter pieces of the wire coming away here. And it needs to happen just to the outside, here on the right, here on the left, of the smaller heart-shaped piece. So again, if you need to stick those together with some tape, do feel free to do so. What I'm going to do is just hold on to it for a second, pop my pliers just where I think that needs to happen. You can see it's just to the right of the rightmost upright. So if I drop that one down, pull that away for now, just at a right angle coming away from the design. Let's do exactly the same thing on the other side now, making sure that you don't get your wires all knotted up together like a great big puzzle, like so. Make sure that they sit one on top of the other, and then repeat on the second side. So again, I'm going to hold this very weirdly now, just to the left of the left upright wire. Once you've decided where that needs to happen, you can drop the longer piece of heart-shaped wire and just push that second wire away. Now we're going to be moving them again in a moment. What we need to do now is to make sure that the smaller heart shape is flat, so that it sits next to the longer tailed heart shape. So that looks pretty reasonable to me. That's going to work. So what we will do now is just pop that down, and you could take that away and hammer around the edge of the heart if you needed to. So what we will do next, once we're happy that the heart shape is flat and it's strong enough, let's make sure that that's a nice sharp angle coming away. You can give that a tiny bit of a wiggle if you need to. What we're going to do is ensure that those two hearts match up perfectly, and then we're going to draw these tails of wire upwards and away slightly. So if I hold that sideways, what we need to do is to bring the angle of the short tails of wire away at about 45° upwards. Now that's one of the more challenging aspects. You just need to make sure that you don't change the shape of your heart. So grip hold of the heart itself, and then you can bring that wire up and away. Just make sure that that's coming at a smooth line. The other alternative is to put it in almost like a key. So you can see I'm holding onto the angle change just here. If you hold that, grip onto the heart shape and just pull that away. So the first one I slightly mangled, so I'm just going to take a moment to make sure that that's nice and straight and that those wires are coming up and away at about 45°. The main takeaway from the first part of today's tutorial is to get those hearts matching, to ensure that there's space all the way around the outside of your heart form, and to ensure that the shorter wires sit outside the longer wires. I'll show you that more closely on the board now. It might take a little while, but it's definitely worth getting right. So stack those heart shapes on top of each other. Ensure that they nestle together so that you can later on attach those two pieces together seamlessly. So we're going to do the same thing twice in essence now, which is to build a tree on both of those heart frames. So I'm going to show you just on one of them, and then off camera I'll create it on the second side. For this part of the tutorial, you're going to need 6-inch lengths of 0.6 or 22 gauge wire. Now this is really sturdy. I tend to use a slightly lighter wire for making tree designs. However, I wanted to ensure that the gemstone is kept nice and safe. So when I'm making a tree like this, it's fairly skeletal. If you want a slightly bushier one, you can always use more pieces of wire, but I'm going to cut 6-inch lengths and I'm going to have 14 of them, 7 for one side and 7 for the other side. And then what we're going to do is attach them all onto the heart frame. 7 on one piece and 7 on the other piece. So you can indeed measure the centre of your lighter gauge wire, but what I'm going to do is just lay one over the top of the heart frame in approximately halfway along that lighter wire. Just pinch it into position and then draw one of the tails all the way around. So it's going to rotate around the edge of the frame, all the way back over the top, down the middle and back again. So they're reasonably the same length, they're not terribly out. If you really do struggle and you've got one that's much longer and one that's much shorter, what you can do is draw the one that's shorter back again so that it takes half a turn away. Hold that in position, bring the longer one round instead, and then rotate on that frame, and they should just even up ever so slightly. They don't need to be exactly the same. The next thing that I'm going to do is just very gently tighten that up. You don't want to be handling that wire overly much. You see there, I just pulled the frame out of shape, but because I hammered it lightly, it's gone straight back to where I want it to be. What I'm going to do next is to add 3 on one side at the lowest section of the heart, 3 on the other side, and then 1 round the centre bottom. So on my channel I have a variety of nature inspired and tree designs in wire. I'll pop a link up to the playlist just now and you can check those out if you want to have a look at some of the different ways that you can create trees in jewellery. I'm just going to go through what to do next. What we're going to do is to start with the topmost 2 wire wraps just on one of the sides, and I'm not going to allow it to go past about 1/3 of the way up. So if that's the bottom, about 1/3 of the way up, that's the maximum amount I want to allow those 2 wires to travel up the side of the frame. I'm going to grip hold of them with my non-dominant hand on the frame at the point I want to use them. I'm going to give that one very short, quick little smooth through. And then I'm going to twist them together. Now what I like to do is just to make sure that they're all sitting side by side before I begin. So if I move my thumb out of the way, you'll see that the uppermost wire has split into 2 and the second wire is also split into 2. Now if I pinch those into position, what I'm going to do is gather them all up and twist as if they're a key. So that's just stage 1. Give it another couple of twists and then you've got the start of a root system of your tree. Now some people very much prefer to not have these gaps down at the base of the tree, but I like to see them because it enables me to just put some funny little angles in there later. For instance, just like this, I can put some interest. I'm being very mindful of my gemstone, I'm not scratching it with my pliers, but you can add a little bit more detail if you want to. So that's the reason there's a gap there. If you don't like that, you can close that up a little bit by just twisting again. So one of the reasons that I hammer the wire, even though it's the 1.25 16 gauge, is just at this stage you can start to pull this out of formation. So down in the middle I'm going to gather 3, so 1 from the right of the frame, 1 from the left of the frame, and 1 that sits down at the very bottom. And again, it's exactly the same thing. I'm just going to gently ensure that all 6 of those wires are sat side by side, and then I'm going to rotate around a couple of times as if I'm turning a key in a lock, and I've got the start of that root system. Exactly the same thing with those last 2 wires. Again, not letting them be any further than about 1/3 of the way up that side of the frame. Holding it upside down doesn't help, but I think you get the picture. So they can be separated. You can have a bit of a gap or you can have them sat together. It doesn't really matter. It's all an artistic representation of a tree. So again, just separating them out gently before turning like a key in a lock to get a little bit of root system going. Now, another reason for leaving a little bit of space down at the base is that because I've hammered the frame on my heart shape, what it means is that there is a slightly more square profile. It's a bit of an oval profile, to be honest. And if you over tighten at this stage, it can be really tricky to just switch those over the top. In fact, I'm going to take them the other way and I'll show you for why. What we want to do is to have these coming over the top and away from the direction of the heart section where the wires are going this way up at the top, the neckline section. We want the wires to come out and away, so in opposition to those 45-degree neck wires. And that's because we want to build a tree that is ever so slightly proud of that frame we've created. So if it's proud, it means that we've got space to put our heart, either cabochon or chubby carving, into that position. If we bring them up on the underside, when we go to put this together, and it will all become apparent in a few minutes, when we go to put it together, there won't be quite as much space. So draw the tree sections up and away towards you, with those neck wires moving away. Then what we're going to do is to gather them all together into one mega tree. Now it's slightly tricky for me because I've got these neck wires here. So what I'm going to do, don't you do this, but I'm going to trim these a little bit shorter so I can show you a little bit more in the focal range. I'm just going to trim those to just under an inch, just so that I can hold it down closer to the board and you can see more clearly. So let's bring those three little bundles together. I'm just going to give it one little bit of a smooth and a warm, and at this stage I can draw those tails of wire that attach to the frame down just a little bit if I want them to. And then when they're sat again side by side, so you've got the leftmost bundle, the rightmost bundle, and in the centre the middle bundle, gives you an opportunity to grip across, sit those down at the bottom where you want them to appear, and then do a couple of little twists, and you'll make yourself a gnarly little tree trunk to begin with. Now I'm not overly going to worry about that not being exactly symmetrical. Trees are very rarely perfectly symmetrical unless they're heavily treated with the loppers. What I'm going to do now is show you one of two ways to draw this into a much smoother trunk. So you can give that a little bit of a warm and then twist really firmly by hand to start drawing that round. That can feel a little bit on your fingertips. You can see there's a little bit of a divot there. So if you have a gentle touch, you can grip around that bundle of wires as close as you can get to the base, the pointy bit of the heart, and just rotate around a couple of times. Now at this point, these two wires may get too close together, so ensure that you don't draw that too tight, otherwise it won't fit onto the other heart-shaped tree that we're going to make. So one of the ways that you can prevent that is to hold the heart shape like so. It doesn't look very nice, but it does prevent the issue. Now I don't want too much going on here, I just want a couple of little twists to bring that tree together. Now in classic tree making fashion, I quite like mine to be all twizzly and wizened, so I'm going to take the trunk over to one side quite firmly before bringing it back in the opposite direction. You might need to twist that a little bit more. And again, if you've got a delicate touch, if you press really hard at this stage and there's a wire that's sticking out at a little bit of a jaunty angle, you stand the chance of actually severing that wire or fracturing it and taking it away from your project. So if that does happen to you, don't worry, because you don't have to have exactly 14 wires connecting around the frame later. You can have 13 or 12 and it won't really matter. However, if that happens to you time and time again because you don't have a gentle touch, that's also fine. Maybe start with slightly more than 7 wires down at the bottom. So let's rotate that around a couple of times, just little by little, to bring the tree back over to the other side. And because this is quite a heavy wire to begin with, you might need to just take a couple of bites of the cherry to get it to do what you want. What I'm going to do now is to start separating my tree out, and there are lots of different ways that you can make a tree. What I might do is take approximately a third of the wires over in one direction. So this is about a third of the wires, and then 2/3 going over to the other side. And I will just twist that together into a large branch, very softly, just rotating those around, because this again is a point in time that you can shed wires if you don't have that gentle touch. However, by this time, let's have a look. We've got 4 wires here to work with. You might find that you can grip that a little bit more by hand, or you might wish to grab hold of your nylon jaw pliers. So let's rotate that around again until we've got a bit of a branch going on. What I'm going to do is just be a little bit stylistic here. So I'm going to show you on this side of the tree the techniques involved for creating that tree shape. So I'm going to subdivide down again to a slightly smaller branch with just 2 wires coming away on this side. And then on the upper one, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Now, what you may notice is when I get down to just 2 or 3 wires at a time, I'm not gripping where the wires are actually close together. I'm gripping across where they are singular. And in that way, you can still get a twist, but you don't have that bigger risk of actually smashing or breaking or fracturing those wires. So again, in a moment, I'm going to do the other side all by myself, but I will show you all of the techniques that you need to make that happen. So I'm just going to put some little bits of definition in the tree as we go through, before the wires start to cross over and get close enough to the very edge of your tree. Now, I've made many trees with little beads on. This is quite a chunky wire, so you'd need reasonably big hole beads. But what I'm going to do is just bring those wires reasonably close to the edge before I leave them naked. You can, as I say, add beads if you want to, or you can just leave them naked like so. Once you've got your tree set up, and as I said, I'll do that in a second, you can start to bring that around the edge. Again, when you start wrapping around the edge of the frame, you may bring these 2 wires too close together, and you want to make sure that it sits still on either side of the neck of the other heart. Don't lose that nice matching shape. So you need to keep your hearts the same, but the shorter wired heart form should be wider than the longer uprights that we've got. So let me just grab that again and show you what I mean. This is a different heart shape that I made earlier, so it won't match exactly right now, but you can see that the 2 short wires are either side of that central upright. So try not to put too much tension into your wrapping. So what I'm going to do is to hold on to the branches and draw the tails around. Now, I reckon you need at least 3 wraps on this frame to ensure that you've got good connection. If you want to have more, do so, but don't put them all on to begin with. Just put 3 on and don't cut the tails, because you might find that some of these wires have travelled more. They might be slightly shorter, and then you can only get 2 wraps, or you can only get 3 wraps, and if you put 5 on some of them, it can just look a little bit odd. So wrap 3 times, leave the tails, go all the way around, create the rest of your tree however wizened and witch-like you want it to be, and then wrap 3 times. Once you're satisfied that you've got enough wire to do more wraps, if you want more wraps, go ahead and do so. And then when you're ready, what we're going to do, I know that I'm going to stick with 3, is trim that tail of wire just past where it goes over the frame at the back. Let's get that out of the way. And then what we're going to do is to make sure that that very naughty little sticky uppy bit, you can see it glinting in the light there. If you just smooth that around, it will sit inside the frame. Make sure it's nice and smooth. We don't want to scratch any hearts that we're going to cage in just a moment. But once you've done that nice and smoothly, you can go all the way around, completing the task. One of the reasons I never ever get bored of making tree of life designs is that they are endlessly different. I don't think I've ever made 2 that are even vaguely similar, try as I might. So don't be afraid to experiment with shapes and forms and how those wires move around. I'm just going to show you a way now to add some interest to those final sort of branches and twigs, and then we will move on to tying everything together. So this is how I made my tree work using the wires that we designed together a moment ago. So I've taken a third of the branches over in one direction, a third off in the opposite direction, and then just continued all the way around to the top. I've managed to wrap 3 times with each of those wire ends, and everything is connected. Now I have brought both of the sides together up at the top by taking the same piece of tree over to one side as is connected here. You don't have to do that, it can be completely separate like this one. So the tree on this side splits entirely down at the base and the branches move On the right hand side only to the right, and on the left hand side only to the left. One thing I would say is it's worth spreading these out a little bit because you don't want your heart or your cabochon to pop out. So let's just pop that one back out of the way for a second, and let's have a look at some of these final branches. So without allowing these two upright sections to get too close together, so I'm just going to put my thumb in between. What you can do is add a little bit more interest into those final little branches if you want to. You can have them be very straight if you want to. It's a stylistic choice, but I quite like them to sort of be wiggling all over the shop. Another thing to mention is that when I'm wrapping the tails around the frame itself, on the right hand side of the frame, I'm wrapping down towards the base. So you get this little spring of 3 wraps and they all move downwards. Now you don't have to do that, but I think it looks really nice if all of the wires are kind of moving in the same direction when you've got that tree finished. So for the next stage, you will repeat on your long upright section, and you can have 2 very different trees. One side could have seed beads on it, for instance, one side without, whatever you fancy really. What we're going to do now is to grab a set of flat pliers, and we're just going to ensure that our short uprights are moving away from us, and we're going to very, very gently lift the tree forwards on the frame. So the finer wire is on top, moves from the centre, and it goes over the top and wraps around. What we're going to do is to address every single little section down here at the roots, and if I show you that sideways, I'm holding very, very softly and then just lifting the roots up and away by twisting the pliers on that frame. I'm not putting any pressure at all on, I'm just using the tip of the pliers to lift ever so slightly on the roots and the branches, so that what we're doing is we're creating a little bit like a shell shape or half of a locket. So every movement is soft and gentle. We're not disturbing the shape of the frame. The frame needs to stay flat, but what we're doing, like I say, is creating a little bit of a cavity. So all the way around. You can do this with the tips of your bent chain nose pliers if you prefer, or use chain nose pliers, but I find that the blunt tip on my flat pliers is the best. If I show you above, this last one is still very, very flat if I pop the pliers on, and they're going over by about 3 millimeters. Just lift ever so slightly, and now you'll see that that's ever so slightly proud and domed. So just make sure that you go all the way around, and this is creating a cavity with the tails pushing away, so you can see that the heart will sit inside that cavity when we bring the 2 halves together. On the other section, the other half of your heart shape, you don't really need to decide which one. If you particularly prefer one side of your tree, then you can make it bend around, but I would say it looks much more attractive if it's the side with the finer gauge wire going over the top that you're then pushing upwards and away. It just looks neater. So the next thing we're going to do is to just see if everything's going to fit together. So we're looking for the shorter side of the heart with those 45-degree angles to sit outside of the narrow, longer upright. So if you just push those together, you'll see whether or not your heart's going to fit. And this is why it's important to leave that gap around the edge, because if you don't, it will be too tight to sew everything together. So that is going to fit. If you get to this stage and you find that you didn't actually leave enough space, you could go for a smaller heart. I think probably this one is just a little bit too little, but let's have a look and see what it seems like. Yeah, that would move around and potentially damage your gemstone. So do try to remember to give yourself that 4 to 5 millimeter gap around the outside of your gemstone when you're making those heart forms, and allow that gap to be larger if you have a chubby heart to work with. So overall, this is going to work really nicely. If you find that you're struggling and you don't have another heart, then try to redress the balance by just pushing a little bit further with that wire bend. So push again, just lift to create a little bit of a cavity. And it's possible that it's the inside of your tree, especially if you've got a really good juicy thick trunk like this one. So you just push that away, making sure that you leave the space in the center so that the two uprights on the long heart will fit in between. So what we're going to do now is to connect the two halves together, a little bit like a locket at this stage. So what we need to do is to make sure that both of those heart frames, just the frames, not the tree, are properly, truly flat, so that they will sit as close as side by side as you can possibly manage. Now this is really the only ever so slightly tricky part of the tutorial today. What we're going to do is to create some loops with the shorter pieces of wire, the ones that are coming away at 45 degrees. So grab yourself some round nose or memory wire finishing pliers and create a nice loop shape. It needs to be chunky enough to fit around the shoulders of the straight wired heart. So let's just start by rolling around, not on the floor, you understand, with the pliers. Roll that wire around. You might need to push by hand, might need to pull some of your tree away, or you might even need to trim that down slightly. So we're looking to create a loop. Let's flip that over in the other direction. That loop's going to be absolutely perfect. Now, with this design, there's so much support that you don't need to create a wrapped loop around the second heart frame. If you were using a lighter wire, that might be something to consider, but that's one of the reasons I suggest hammering, and we're then going to add so many more layers. So once you've got that loop shape, I might take that slightly smaller, to be honest. Just hold carefully. You see that in the light. I'll do the top one in a second. Push that through. And then what we're going to do is trim away that last little bit. So use the flush side of your cutters. Look twice. Let's clear the board slightly. And then make sure you're trimming the right piece of wire off, because it's very disappointing if you don't. And then we're just going to straighten that loop up and make sure the upper side of it is still up at 45 degrees. I'll do the same on the second side. It is slightly tricky to see with so much else going on, but let's roll that wire around. So again, I'm going to grip that extended piece of wire. Start by bringing that around until it matches the first one, and then you can probably estimate that I can take some of that wire away, which will indeed make it slightly easier to finish that bend. So let's just trim that even shorter. The overall length is probably no more than 3/4 of an inch, but I'd always rather trim too little and then have to trim a little extra off. So we'll start at the end of that section and just rotate around until you get that nice circular form, sitting into the middle of that upper heart shape. If you struggle with your round nose pliers, what you can do is grip in with your chain nose pliers and just get that loop to finish. So we're looking for 2 loops. The upper side of the loop to be at around about 45 degrees, doesn't need to be exact. We just need to check that that's going to fit over the top. It will stand proud at the moment. Yep, that's still wide enough to fit either side of those 2 uprights. So what we'll do now is strengthen those loops. If you want them to be exactly the same, do take a second to make sure that they're exactly the same. I would probably just trim a teeny tiny extra bit away on this side, again making sure that you're trimming the correct wire before making that complete loop shape, and then strengthening both of those loops as much as you can. So I'm just squishing across those closed up loops. And then I'm going to commit the cardinal sin and open them incorrectly. So I've made my loops and I'm just going to support the tree whilst opening both of those loops up, and then we're going to hook onto the underside of the other heart, the one with the long tails. So this one has been processed so that there's a gap on this side. So I just need to flip that over, and then I'm going to hook on with the second half of that heart, just either side of those uprights. Bring those around so that they connect at the neck, either side of those uprights, and then close those loops back up neatly. Now that's very difficult to show you on camera. It's very easy to achieve. We're just closing both loops up. They're simple loops, yes, but they're in a very heavy wire, and before we moved them, they were indeed strengthened. So let's just hold that in position. Close the loop up so that it meets that angle change, and then you've got like a little clamshell or like a locket that's relatively well connected. Now you may find that you need to just modify the shape of the heart. I just pulled that out of true slightly. So I'm just going to make sure that that sits on top of the first heart and that they match perfectly. So do take your time, as I'm going to do now, to make sure, and you might just need to grab hold of that loop and ever so slightly modify how it sits until your two hearts match up once more. So I've taken a good 5-10 minutes or so just to make sure that I'm overall delighted with the frame and that they match each other perfectly. So what had happened for me is that the frames had come slightly out of true, so I've made sure that both of those main heart-shaped frames are completely flat, and also that the hearts now match up. So what we're going to do now is to weave a little bit of basket weave up on the neckline just to stabilise the project before we move on to setting the cabochon or your gemstone carving into position. I'm going to be working from the reel for this next section because it means that I won't cut my wire overly short. I'm going to use just a slightly lighter wire now, 0.5mm 24 gauge. And what we're going to do is just a basic basket weave. So let's start off just up at the top here by wrapping 3 times around. So what I'll do is I'll go twice, and then I'll use my pliers just to tuck that last little tail around, just preserving any wastage. So you may find that you want to do a different number of rotations. I'm going to go for a classic 3 and 3 basket weave. So I'm just tidying up that little spiral, that little coil, before bringing this all the way down to the base of the design. So classic basket weave means that we're rotating in one direction on one of those 2 uprights, and then we will switch. So the finer gauge wire is coming off the top of the wire that's lower on your screen. I bring the tail of wire that's connected to the reel down the centre and take it underneath the other side. So let's draw that up and around. We're on the uppermost of those 2 wires as per your screen right now. And I'm just going to wrap 3 times around the second wire, bringing it back down the centre, scooching those wires together to keep them nice and neat and tidy. Now what this is going to do, as well as giving us some wire to create a nice wrapped bail, is it's going to stabilise the frame a little bit so that we can sew into position our heart, cabochon or carving. So I'm just going to continue weaving in exactly the same fashion. So the wires come down the centre, underneath my lower wire. We're going to wrap 3 times around this one. So that's 1, that's 2, and that's 3. You can, if you want to preserve your nails, use your pliers just to tighten those little wraps up. Make sure that they're nice and neat and tidy. The wire comes down the centre and then underneath on the other side. So you're always switching which direction you're rotating. And I'm just going to do about 1.5 inches of weaving up these 2 neckline wires. So I've taken my time to weave about 1.5 inches of that basic plain basket weave to create a very simple bail. You could go for something a little bit more fancy if you wanted to. You could turn this into a Loki bail as seen on a number of my videos, or we could just go for a basic wrap. It's absolutely up to you what you do with that. So at this stage I'm just going to sort the bail out and then we will sew the cab or carving into position. I'm going to grip across just above that nexus point where those 2 halves of the clamshell come together, and I'm going to define which one I want to be thinking of as my front. They are both beautiful, so if you have a preferred tree that you've created, maybe that's the front. Either way, it's going to be a jewel-faced pendant and it really doesn't matter. So let's grip across that neckline, and I'm using the very, very flat pliers, so the same distance at the tip as they are at the box joint. Pull that wire forward at around about 45 degrees. Now you can use your bail making pliers or you can grab a wooden dowel if you have one. Let's just warm that through slightly. Now normally when we're warming wire we would be stroking along to get that nice and smooth and fluid. You can't do that when you've wrapped, so let's just press that to get it nice and toasty. It's quite warm today in Britain, so that's pretty warm already. I'm just going to rotate that neckline section around until it sits flat, like so. And then what we will do is turn out those two ends. Now one of them is going to be higher than the other from the nature of that basket weave. So I don't know if you can see, but on the right hand side it's higher because I finished on the left hand side with those last 3 wraps. So I'm just going to turn those away at the position of the last wrap on both sides. And then let's take this one in the opposite direction. So one slightly higher than the other. Now I will just pop my round form back into position. You could use a marker pen or a pencil or whatever you fancy. And now I'm just going to force that to sit down. So 1.5 inches of wrapping equates to a gap of 9.5 millimeters or 0.37 of an inch. So that gives you some idea. I like to make oversized bales because it means that I can use any threading material. I just want to centralize that rear section behind the front section so that it remains nice and tidy. Now one of these is lower and it's this section because that's the side I finished that basket weave on. So what I'm going to do is grip just past that point with my chain nose pliers, you can see in the light just past where that wrapping finishes, and pull the wire forwards. It's quite nice, the clamshell's just opened up to show you how it works. At the moment it's just a hinge. And what we're going to do now is make sure, if I turn that back to the correct orientation, you can see there's a teeny tiny gap after the wrapping before the wire comes forwards. And that's because when I start to get this tail super warm and soft and ready to wrap, you close up for a moment please. It means that when I pull that around, and again you could leave your mandrel in position if it will fit completely. If not, you can use a slightly smaller one just to ensure that that stays nice and round. And what we're going to do is to draw the tail all the way around the lower section of that neck, back around one more time, or as many times as you fancy, to be quite honest. But what we're doing is we're creating a nice solid bale. Now at this stage I'm not actually going to complete the spirals. I love to have spirals front and back on this design. I think it looks really attractive. If we put those spirals in now, it will stop that clamshell from opening and closing quite so nicely. One of the ideas of designing this particular project is that if you wanted to, you could keep it very, very simple with the next step and change out the gemstone. However, I'm going to seal mine in. What we will do with the other tail of wire is exactly the same as on the first side. Let me remove that mandrel to show you just for a moment. We're going to grip just past where that wrapping finishes, push the wire back so that there's a little bit of extra wire just between the last wrap before the wire changes direction. It's about 1.5 to 2 millimeters. And that just means when I pull this around the design, it doesn't make the bale bend. It leaves it nice and smooth. So I'm just going to bring that tail of wire all the way around one more time. And they can just sit there until I'm ready to use them. To make my life slightly easier, I'm going to warm them through and just bring this up and away. And all I will do with those is I'll cut them to about 1.5 inches and make spirals and put that on after we've sewn the gemstone into position. So to finish off our project today, we're basically going to sew our chosen gemstone or cabochon into the middle of that little locket or cabochon holder. Don't know what you want to call it really. And I'm going to show you my demonstration piece with that lovely agate was sewn together with a slightly heavier wire, but today I'm going to work with a 0.5mm or 24 gauge to hold everything together. It's definitively strong enough to do the job, but has a slightly more delicate touch. I'll show you them side by side at the end of the video. So I have a cut length here of around about 12 or so inches of that 0.5mm 24 gauge, and what we need to do is to find somewhere that we can add it on to the frame. Now here's a slightly more naked part of the frame on this side. It doesn't matter which side you start, as long as we get 3 or 4 really good strong wraps around that frame. So you can see the difference already in the wire between which we made the tree with, which was 0.6mm 22 gauge, and that which we're going to sew things together with, which is the 0.5 or 24 gauge. So if I just pop around about 3/4 of an inch over the end, it's a little bit tricky to get in there, so I'm going to use my pliers just to wrap that around. going to be quite difficult to show you because I've chosen the least visibly accessible bit to add that wire into. All we're doing is wrapping 3 times around the frame wherever you can find an access point. So hopefully you can see this, even if it means I'm holding it like an absolute lunatic. Bring that all the way round and just get a really good purchase on that frame. So I'm going to put a little bit of tension in it without deforming the shape of that heart all the way around. And as we did with the ends of the tree wires, we're going to finish off with the cut end as inside that wire frame as possible. So let's just make sure that we get that nice and neat and tidy. It's only awkward because I've got to hold it for the camera. This is not an awkward bit of the tutorial. So just make sure that that's good and strong and that you tidy those wraps up really neatly, because a neat wrap is a strong, long-lasting wrap. So I'm just pulling that around until the cut end sits dead inside the frame. So you need to grip that spiral and just draw it around until you see that cut end in the correct position. Now let's grab our chosen puffy cab. So this is a beautiful silky kunzite. I'm going to sit that inside, and for a time being it's going to wiggle around and be really annoying, but then it's going to look lovely. So if I draw that wire across, hopefully you'll be able to see, here we go, that the finer gauge wire is sticking over the top of the rear frame, and what we want to do then is to take it underneath the front frame. So just push that through wherever you can find an access point. What you will need to be wary of is that you don't accidentally put a kink in it. So I usually control that by just popping a digit in the loop until I can bring that round to a point where I can just pull that through, get some tension between those 2 frames without causing any damage to it. And we're just going to sew backwards and forwards as we move around the frame. So I've come over the top of the rear frame and underneath the front frame. Pull that so that there's tension, but not so much that you're undoing your spiral. We're going to take the tip of the wire, and because we've come over the top now of the front frame, I'm going to take it underneath that rear frame. And I'm just taking it to random points between the tree where they attach to the frame. And if you find any bits that aren't quite perfect while you're going around like I just have, give that a bit of a smush to make it sit neat and tidy. So I'm going to show you what might happen. You might get a little bit of a knot if you don't control your wire. So what I tend to do is to pop a finger or a thumb through until I can't get it through anymore, and then I'm going to put my thumbnail over the top of that front frame whilst I pull the wire through. What that means is that the wire will pop down in between those 2 frames exactly where I want it to, and it won't go on the wonk or it won't have a funny deviation in it. So again, I'm just coming over the top of what is now the right hand frame. So I'm going to bring the wire down underneath the front frame, or the one that's showing on the left, push that all the way through for a second, and then again I just need to control this section of wire so that it doesn't get a kink in. Pull that through. Now that's got a lovely loop in it. My gemstone can fall out for right now, I really don't mind. Pull that through a little bit. Let's get the gem back in position. And if I hold it over the top, I'll show you again. I just want to use my thumbnail to ensure that that wire sits exactly where I want it to. So just guide that into position. You don't really want it on top of one of the tree wraps, ideally between. So again, a little bit of tension. And then we're just going to go backwards and forwards, so over the top of what is looking like the front frame, underneath the rear frame, pull that all the way around. And as we get into position, you can pop your thumbnail over the top, and you can see on this quite naked bit exactly what I'm trying to say, which is that the wire has good tension between those 2 points. Pull it back in the opposite direction. Let's just post that through while it's visually easy to see. So over the top of the rear frame, underneath the front frame, pull that all the way through. Now you can see if you just yank the wire, that's going to go horribly wrong. So we're going to control the wire's descent, pull that through until you get a really lovely bit of tension in there. and you're just going to sew both halves together as you move all the way around. When you get to the other end, it doesn't matter if you finish on the front or the back frame or even up on the neckline, as long as you get 3 good wraps that will seal itself up nicely. When I've finished, I'm going to cut these 2 end sections to about 1.5 inches, create little spirals. I've shown you it so many times, and just push them down over that central section. Before I finish up today, what I'll do is I'll take a photo of these side by side. The agate was made in 1.25mm 16 gauge frames, and everything else was 0.6mm 22 gauge. The kunzite one, I used the heavier 0.6 22 gauge wire for the tree, and then switched to a slightly lighter 0.5 24 gauge for the sewing and for the neckline section where we created that bail. If you're still watching, thank you very much. I know it's a little bit more of a workout for the fingers using those heavier wires. I hope that you've enjoyed today's tutorial, the Heart Cab Gem Tree Pendant Wrap. Let's just say my fingertips have felt it. I'll take a photograph of that and put it next to the agate one that I started off by showing you earlier on. I hope that you've enjoyed it. If you do enjoy the content, please do consider subscribing to the channel. I upload a new video every Tuesday, 7 PM British time, 2 PM Eastern time in the States, and I hope that you have the most wonderful day. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel. Bye for now.